So in this video, we're going to build a community platform using NextJs, Neon and Prisma as our database, and Clerk for user management and authentication. And at the end, we're going to add a customer onboarding flow using Upstash workflows. Now, let me show you from a high level what we are going to build, and then we're going to jump into the code and build this from scratch together. So we have this community platform on the right-hand side where you can add companies. Each company can have different users. We have events. So these are different company events, different community posts and whatnot. But in this video, we're going to focus on this company and then users onboarding to this company. So for example, if we have this company here, it has some information about the company and there is a team member. So as users sign in and create an account on our platform, we want to onboard them to select the company that they work for as an example of a custom onboarding flow. We're going to then send some welcome emails, follow-up emails, and anything really to schedule to happen with Upstash workflows. So let's jump right into the code and get started. So we're going to start from scratch from this NextJs template. There's a link in the description where you can also start from the same place. We're going to use this as a template to create a new repository. We're going to name this Next Community, and then let's create this repository. And once we have this made, which is a template with NextJs, ShatCN, and already set up for light and dark theme, there's a video on the channel where I talk about implementing or integrating ShatCN into NextJS. I'm going to include a link in the description for that video as well. If you're not familiar with ShatCN UI, it's a great, amazing library for building UIs. So you can watch that video. So we're going to clone this newly created repository, which was off of our NextJs template, into our local dev environment. So I'm going to go git clone and then the repository. I'm going to select the current working directory because I've already created this next community, so it doesn't recreate that. And I'm already here, so let's pmi to install the dependencies, and we're going to look at it from a high level to just know what we're working with, and then we're going to start adding the necessary features for our community platform. Okay, so pm dev, and let me just close the terminal here. Let's open up localhost and see what we're working with or what we're starting with. Okay, here we go. So we have our template running. As I mentioned, it does come with a light and dark theme with a header and a footer and basically a simple homepage. So from a high level, this is our layout. We're using some of the new fonts introduced by Vercel. It's called Gist, and then the Inter font and a serif font, your regular stuff that you would set inside of your NextJS app or what NextJS actually ships with. What I have done on top of it is adding this providers component, which is a client component for sharing any React context with our entire app. Here we are sharing the theme provider and a toast provider. This is a toast notification component from ShatCN that if you want to use, we're going to use. We are setting this provider or wrapping our entire app with this provider, so we can call the toast function from anywhere to just show this toast notification. This is a pattern that you would use as a provider's pattern that wraps the entire app with a client component to share context. And I have a header, a main that wraps any nested layout and children, and a footer. So this is where we're starting from. So in the first step, why don't we start adding Prisma and create a Neon database, which is a serverless Postgres database, and then define some models, define some tables to be able to then create companies and then continue on from there. So let's start from Neon. If you haven't signed up for an account, you can go ahead and sign up for an account. I do have a video on the channel talking about Neon as well, so you can watch that video. There's a link in the description where we talk about Neon from a high level and how you would go about integrating it into NextJS using Prisma. So definitely watch that video if you're not comfortable with the concepts that I'm sharing here, but I'm going to walk you through a simple implementation for our application here. So let's create a new project. We're going to call this Next Community. I'm going to leave the defaults and create the project. Now we're going to need our connection string, which you can find under the dashboard. The good thing about Neon is that it allows you, or it manages a pooled connection for you. So anytime that you are deploying Next.js applications to, let's say, a platform like Vercel, your API endpoints or your backend code is deployed as serverless functions. And these serverless functions run in isolation from one another. So therefore, they connect to your database on a different connection string. Now, if you have multiple users using your service or your website, you're going to end up with multiple connections to your database, and you can exhaust the number of connections that you have to a database because it's a limited number. Now, Neon is going to manage automatically a pool of connection for you to use. So instead of exhausting the number of connection, it manages that pool for you, which is great. Now, we're going to have to copy this inside of our code. But before we do that, let's actually install Prisma, which is going to be the tool that we're going to use to define our schemas, models, tables, and then connect to our Neon database. So let me just stop the dev server here. I'm going to go pm add Prisma. I'm using pm as a package manager. You can use npm if you like that more. Once we have installed Prisma, we can run pm dlx Prisma init. This is going to initialize a new Prisma schema for us, which we're going to see in a second. Let me just clear this out and open up. So this has created this Prisma.schema for us, which is where we're going to define our models, and also created this .env for us, where we can define our database connection string. This is how we're going to connect to our Neon database. So I'm going to get rid of these up top, and I'm going to get rid of this connection string. And now we're going to just copy our pooled connection string by clicking on this copy, if this is big enough for you guys to see. So on the dashboard on Neon, there is this selection section that you can just copy your connection string and bring it over here. So I'm going to copy my connection string and be back in a second. Okay, so I have copied my connection string, and I also created this .env.example to keep track of all the environment variables that we need to set throughout the project. So you have a reference, but you need to create your own .env. Now, one thing to pay attention to is that .env is not by default inside of your git ignore. So you want to add this into your git ignore so that you're not committing the .env to with your secrets to your Git repository. So that's out of the way. Now we have the Prisma connection and database connection string already set inside of our environment variable. And now here, this is the Prisma, schema.prisma. This is where you're going to define the models that you're going to use inside of your application. So let's start from a user model. So I'm going to create a model called user. GitHub Copilot is giving me some suggestions. So we have an email, we have an ID. Let's just get rid of this too and then start creating our own. So we're going to have a foreign key Clerk user ID. This is going to be of type string, and it's going to be unique. And the reason why I'm creating this is that we're going to manage our users and authentication with Clerk, but I want to sync the data that I have in Clerk to my own database using webhooks, which we're going to go through. But for that, I'm going to store a foreign key inside of my own database that references the ID or the Clerk user ID that's inside of Clerk. So that's the Clerk user ID. Now I'm going to have a first name. This is going to be string. It can be optional depending on the way that the user selects to log into our account. Last name, we're going to have an image URL. Again, optional. We're going to have created at and updated at, and let's add a bit more here. We're going to have a job title. This is, to allow users to also create a profile for themselves, maybe post in some social links, maybe a linked in URL, and so forth and so on. So from a high level, we have the ID, email, the Clerk user ID or foreign key, first name, last name, image URL, and some optional information. The created at is when every record is created, defaults to now, and then the updated at, which is going to be automatically populated by Prisma anytime that you're updating a user. Now, the next model that I want to define is a company. Excuse me. So model company. Okay. So every company has an ID, name. Okay. And I want to add a slug, and it needs to be unique. It can have a tagline. So let's add a tagline. It can have a description. What else do we want? Maybe they need some contact information. Let me just get rid of this. The contact information I want to have, maybe they have a phone number, maybe they have an email, maybe they have a website, sure. And then we're going to have some users. So we can have some staff, which is an array of users. And for this, we're going to create the same connection or fields inside of our user. So let me just put it like so. So every user belongs to a company. This is optional because once the first time that the user is created, they don't have or they don't belong to any company, or this field is not populated. We're going to send them to the onboarding flow for that exact reason, to select the company that they're working for. So therefore we can populate this field as well and connect them to a company. So a company can have many users, but each user needs to work for one company. So that's that. Now a company can provide different services. So we can create a model for our services. So let's say model service. We can have ID, name. We don't need a slug really. Maybe we add a description. We leave that description. So we have a name, we have description, and now this needs to also connect to a company with a company ID. And this can be also optional. So this is optional. And then here I can have services be an array of service. So again, our connections, a company can offer different services, so it can be connected to different services. And each service, we can create services independently. They don't need to have companies, but eventually we would want to add them to companies. So these are our services. Now, let's also define a category model. So each of our companies have a category of, maybe we can add a name. This autopilot is helping me here. So name, description, and then company. So let's remove this and add the description as an optional field. And then this can have companies. And then now if I hit save here, you see Prisma automatically creates the required fields here for me. So if I copy these two and bring it up here, so we have the relations all there. So every company belongs to a category. You can make it optional or you can force it to have a category. I want to force this because inside of our search, we want to be able to search based on categories. Something that I forgot to show inside of our company page is that you can filter companies by their name or by their categories or sort them, which we're going to implement together. So we want to force this category so every company belongs or has a category so we can use a filter. And then so a category can belong to many companies, or many companies can be inside the same category in a different way, in another words. And then so this is what we need to for our category, really. Okay, so we have the models that we need. So from a high level, just to review, we have the user, the company, the service, and the category. So now that we have defined our models, what we want to do is to generate the Prisma client. So we're going to run pm dlx Prisma generate. This is going to create a specific or tailored Prisma client that's based on this models that we created. Now, when you run this for the first time, it also installs the Prisma client. You can just manually install this as well. But if you run it, it's going to install that Prisma client. This is what we use to create a Prisma client and then connect to our tables. Now, anytime you change your schema or create your schema for the first time, you need to run this Prisma generate command, but you also need to run Prisma db push. So you push these changes to your remote database. In this case is our Neon database. So let's confirm that everything went through here. So if I go to the tables inside my Neon database, I should see the same tables: category, company, service, and users. So this is really great to be able to work with our remote database. So we're going to start the dev server here. And one thing you can do to actually work with your database locally is to use Prisma Studio. So you can run pnpm dlx inside of a new terminal and go to Prisma and then Studio. This is going to run a local dev server and host your database right inside of here instead of having to go to Neon dashboard. You can do it from here to add records and stuff as well, but we're going to use Prisma Studio, which makes it very easy to work with our database. So let's put this inside here. Let me make this a bit bigger. So now that we have this, let's create some records. Now you can create an admin dashboard for your community platform so that your admin can come in, create different categories, services, and enter companies. In this case, we're just going to directly create these records inside of our database like so. But you get the idea if you wanted to create an admin dashboard. So the first category, let's say it's software. Let's have another record that is maybe accounting. Maybe another one can be real estate. Another one can be mortgage. So let's save these categories. They're good for now. And let's also go ahead and create some services that our company would offer. So some of the services, you can create the company and then define the services at the same time, but whichever way works better, doesn't really matter. Sorry, I forgot to put any names. So for the service, let's say UI and UX design. Let's create a software company and the possible services that they can have. Let's say custom software solutions. Sure, why not? So, and then web design and development. So let's save these changes. So we have now services. Now let's go back to creating a company now. So let's create a company. Let's call this a Studio H. Let's give it a slug Studio H. Tagline can be software, or let's say web design and development. The description can be software company designing and developing web and custom software solutions. We can give you the phone number. Can give you that email. Let's put my own email here. Websites. These are optional, but you get the idea. And staff, we don't have any staff for now. And that's where a user would come in, sign in, and then we would onboard them to this company. We can select some services that this company offers. And let's say category, this is a software company. And we made the category to be forced. So you see It was red when I didn't have anything to say this is a required field. Now let's save these changes, and now we have our first company with some services and categories. So let's go back to our application, making sure that our dev server is running. Let me just close this off. And as the first step, why don't we create some functions that talks to our database and then fetches some data. So the first thing that we want to do is to create a Prisma client. So prisma.ts. This is a client where we're going to share our Prisma connection or client throughout our app. So we're not going to duplicate our Prisma client. Let me just cheat and copy some code here. Let me explain what it is. So this is directly from the documentation. When you're working in local development, because of the hot module reload, anytime that you're creating a change, if you don't do this, it's going to create a new Prisma client. To avoid that in development, we're going to just store our Prisma client inside of a global disk object and share that throughout our app. And if you're not in the production, we're going to just pass in the Prisma client. So that's the first step, to have a Prisma client. Now, what I like to do usually here inside of my lib is to create organized files based on my table. So I'm going to have a module for companies, and here I'm going to just import or create functions that talk to my companies table or that specific model. So then I can organize them in a nice way and then import them and use them wherever I need inside my application. So let's go to companies. I'm going to copy some code to just speed up this process, but I'm going to explain what we're creating over here. So inside of my companies lib folder, I'm creating two functions. One, get companies or get all the companies, and the other one, get company by slug. So get companies is expecting a limit. Instead of fetching all of my companies, you can pass in a limit to only fetch 1, 2, 3, or 6 companies. And it also accepts a sorting. This is just custom. You can just eliminate this or add more options to it. But the point of the matter is that this is using Prisma and then accessing the company table or the model and then finding many records. It's ordering by whatever sorting option I have sent. And I've only passed descending, so it only orders descending. You can also have another option here to know your sort order. If I am passing a limit here, because it's optional, I'm going to use the take. So this little piece of query that we're passing into find many is going to work as a pagination. So it takes only certain number of limits, maybe 6 documents, 4 documents, whatever you pass to it. And if I don't have any limit, I just return an empty object, which doesn't limit the number of records we're fetching. I'm also including my category records. I'm not sure why there is the red squiggly here. Let's just check our schema.prisma here, bring it here as a reference. So each company is going to have, okay, so this is spelled with capital C. I'm going to bring it to be smaller. Usually when this is automatically created by Prisma, it just references them with capital names. For the sake of naming conventions in my code, I usually use the lowercase. So let's just check here as well. Company ID. So making sure anything that's a relation field, it is using the same naming convention. Seems that it's good now. So let's open up our dev, go here. Let's just clear this out. So anytime you change your schema, you need to run Prisma generate. And you have to also run pm dlx prisma db push to push these changes to your remote, in this case Neon database. And that's that. And now I can restart my Prisma Studio. So for the studio to also read the correct schema, you need to run the Prisma generate and then run the Prisma Studio again. So you have the updated version. Now going back here, Let me just also restart the dev server, close this up. Now if I go to my companies, the squiggly line is gone because this was a lower case which wasn't matching my uppercase category. Okay, so I'm finding companies, or I'm fetching companies, and I'm also including category. Category is a relation, so this is how you would include or bring in fetch connected relations in Prisma. So you would put include and then category true. The next function I've defined here, get company by slug, just finds a unique record inside of our company table where the slug is the slug that I've passed to this function. It includes the staff, order them by their last name, includes the services this company offers, and the category it belongs to. So this is for our dynamic slug page where we want to go to individual company page and see their services, categories, and their staff. We're going to use this function. Now, the other set of functions that I want to create is for our categories. So let's create another one that is for categories.ts. Let me also bring in some categories functions over here and explain what we're doing. We have only one function here, get all categories and order them by name. So that's good. The other one I want to create is functions to work with users. We haven't implemented anything about the users because we don't have authentication yet, but let's create this user model first, and then we're going to work with Clerk and bring in authentication into our app. So users.ts, it's again a module for all of the functions that relate to our user table inside of our database. So let me just close them off. From a high level, I'll explain what we're doing here. So the first function that I have is get users, all of the users. You can pass in a limit, the same convention or style as what we have already seen with the companies. We order them by last name. If you have passed in the limit, I'm going to use this take parameter to limit the number of records returning. I'm returning users or returning error. Again, there's another function to create a user. This is going to call prisma.user.create and pass in the data. Pretty straightforward. Get a user by ID, get a user by email, get update user. You can pass in an ID and then some data. It's going to update a specific user with that ID with the data that you have passed. Delete a user. Combined name is just combine first name and last name. This is how records come from Clerk. They have a separate first name and last name, and I'm just adding them together here to be able to use them in a nice manner inside of our application. Okay, so we created our users, categories, and companies. You can create one for services, but we don't really need it here because when we're fetching our companies inside of company by slug, we included the services here, so it just automatically fetches them. I don't need extra functions to just talk to services. If you need, you can create another module that contains all of your objects or functions that talk to your services. So let's close this off. Now we have our data over here. So why don't we actually fetch some companies inside of our homepage to be able to now show them. We have one record inside of our database, and let's go ahead and go to our homepage over here. And now what we want to do here is to get our companies. So I'm going to go const companies, and I'm going to await the function that we just created, get companies from our lib. Now we need to turn our function into an async function. This is a server component, so you can turn it into an async component or function and just await your data fetching. And because it's a server component, it runs on the server, so you can securely fetch data from your database. Now, once we have this, we can update our section to also render these companies. So what I'm doing here is that inside of this container class that centers everything, I have this header to say new companies, and then I'm going to map over companies, and for each company, I'm going to show this company item, which is a list item. And then at the end, I'm going to have a link that goes to all companies pages that we're going to create together. So let's start with company item here. This is going to be a list item, a card to nicely show our company. So inside of the components, I'm going to create a new component. Let's call this company item.tsx. Okay, so let me close this off and explain to you what we're doing from a high level. So company item is a component. It receives a company and just shows the information for that company in a card from ShadCN. So company name, description, and literally a link here to go to that specific company individual slug page. Okay, now for this we need the card component from ShadCN. So anytime you need a new component, you can just run pm dlx ShadCN. Now before you had to go ShadCN-UI, but now recently they have just renamed it to ShadCN. So you can go ShadCN add latest and then add the name of the component you wanted to add. In this case is a card component. So I add this to my project. Again, if you're not comfortable with ShadCN and how to work with it, watch the video in the description to learn how to integrate ShadCN in NextJs and use theming, which is great. So we have this card component. Now let's go back. We have this also imported here. Okay. So we are fetching the companies and we are mapping over companies, and then for each one we are just showing a card component, some information, and then a link to go to the view all companies page. So let's go to our application and refresh. Okay, so we have new companies and then one company that we created here, a link to go to the all companies page and to the individual slug company page. So let's create these actually. Inside of our app, I'm going to create a folder called companies, and I'm going to put a page.tsx inside of it. So companies tsx. Let me just again copy some code. Now, from a high level, what we're doing here, similar to what we did in the previous page, is to call the get companies to get all of our companies. But we also want to get all the categories because we want to just render a list for folks to be able to filter based on different categories. Now, we need these companies, which is a list of all companies, together with the filtration mechanism and states to create this. So let's just go ahead and create this component. This is a bit complex, but I'm going to walk you through what exactly we're doing here. So inside of components, I'm going to create a new component called companies.tsx. Let's copy some code and see what is happening here. Now I need a couple of components from ShadCN, so let's actually bring them in and then we're going to walk through what we need or what this component is actually doing. So pm dlx ShadCN add latest. Now, anytime that you want to add a couple of components, you can just run the add command without the name of the component. This is going to then show a list of all the components that you can just circle through, and then with a space, you can select and deselect the component that you want. So we need the badge. So let's select the badge. Let's select button we already have. Let's select, well, we didn't need this one. So badge, we need the input. We need checkbox. We need separator, popover, and select. So popover should come first. Popover, select, and separator it was. So then enter. It's going to install all of those components now, which is literally going to copy the code inside of our component UI folder. So let's pm dev again. Close the terminal. So we have all the components that we need. So let me explain to you what we're doing from a high level inside of this companies folder. So we received all the companies and we received all the categories. Now here I'm holding state for sorting for the query parameter that, not the query parameter, but a search that the user can type in. So we're going to filter our companies depending based on their names. We can also give them an option to filter based on categories. I'm calling them tags. So I'm holding a reference to the selected tags or to the selected categories and filter my companies based on the categories. So where the company category ID is equal to the ID of what the user has selected. And remember, when I was fetching my companies, I also included the category, so they already come with the category. And then we're going to render them here. So we have an input field where you can search companies. We have a popover for actually selecting the category. We have different sortings. And then at the end, we're going to get the filtered companies and then show them inside of a list using that same company item we created before. Okay, so with this out of the way, if I go ahead to all company page, we should be able to see a list of our companies and a way to actually search. So let's close all of this. Okay, so we have it on the right hand side. As you can see, I have a search here to be able to search. Well, if I start searching for something that already exists or doesn't, it just filters. Now, as I mentioned, the category is also showing some categories here. We're going to have to see what is wrong with this category thingy here. But you can, let's say, select software. This shows this one. If you select a different category like accounting, this eliminates. And we have the sorting, which is basically sorting based on their name. So let me see what is wrong with this popover here. Okay, so I refreshed the page and this seems to be working now. I just needed to be reloaded again to read the components. So we have the sorting, we have the categories, and we can search. Now that we have the all companies page, let's also create the individual slug page where we can just dive into this specific component. So when I click on it, you can see it goes to companies and then that specific company slug. So let's go back to our page here inside of our app, inside of companies. I'm going to create a dynamic folder called slug. And then inside of it, I'm going to create a page.tsx, which represents that dynamic slug page. So bear with me for a second, where we're going to explain the code over here. So it really gets the slug from NextJs. This is sent automatically inside of the params object. It's named slug because we named this directory slug. Once we have that slug, we're going to use the same function we created in the beginning to get company by slug, pass that slug to get the company. If there is no company, we can either call the not found function and render a custom 404, or just render something like this that I'm doing here. You can add the not found function as well. There's a video on the channel where I have an example of how to use not found or how to create a custom 404. So watch that if you don't know how to use that. And really here, we're just rendering the information for the company. So name, tagline, the services they offer, a contact card, their phone number, email, and website, a way to visit their website. And then at the end, we have the members or the staff. There, we're going to map over the staff of this company, and for each one, we're going to render a member item. So let's actually also create this member item, which is basically just rendering information about every user. So pretty straightforward, but let's just create this member as well. So I'm going to say member and then .tsx. Let me copy some code. Again, here we are passing in a member, which is of type user from our Prisma client to this member component. This is just basically rendering the user's information, such as their name, job title, if they have their social logins or links, their social links over here. Let me see what this is squiggly line is again for. Maybe we named it differently inside of our schema Prisma. Let's close this up. So each user can have, so my bad, it's linked in URL. So let's just bring this from here so that I'm not messing up the spelling again. Now with this, again, anytime you make any changes to your schema, you have to run npm dlx prisma generate, then pm dlx prisma db push to sync our schema with our remote database, pm dev, and let's also rerun the Prisma Studio. We are not using those social links, but just for good measures, dlx Prisma Studio to run our studio again. So this is the new version. I'm going to close the other one. Okay. So we have added the member. Let's also come back here. We have already imported the member up top. So this is just showing the company information as well as the member. So going back to our app, if I click on this specific company now, it should take me to companies, that individual slug page, where it's going to fetch the company information, show their information, and then potentially their staff or employees. But we don't have any users now, so it's not showing here. So in the next step, why don't we add Clerk as our user management and authentication provider, and then add a custom onboarding flow where when a user signs in, we redirect them to an onboarding page where they can select the company they work for, and then we would update our records, our database, and also Clerk with this information. So let's go to Clerk. Let me start from the docs. So clerk.com, let's bring it here. Now inside of the docs, there are framework-specific documentation such as NextJs that you can follow to install Clerk and then bring in your environment variables and adding your middleware. So let's create a new project alongside this. I'm going to create this next community. Let's hit enter. It's using email and Gmail or Google social login for the beginning. You can update this inside of your account. If you're not comfortable with Clerk, I do have a video about, again, integrating user management in Next.js using Clerk, specifically the version 2, because they have updated Clerk and the middleware and the way it works. So let's go ahead and install Clerk, pm add Clerk. Let's copy this from here. Go back to our app. Let's close everything here. And now we want to just install Clerk. The second step, every time you create a project, you need to bring in this environment variables to your environment variable. So I'm going to copy this inside of my .env, and then I'll be back. Okay, so I have copied my environment variables, but I've also referenced them inside of our .env.example, so you have a reference of your environment variables. Now we need to create a middleware and import the Clerk middleware to be able to protect any route that we want. So let me close this off. Inside of the root, I'm going to create a middleware.ts and copy this code. Now what this is doing is going to run the middleware on every route. The config matcher is a Next.js specific config, which tells Next.js for what path to run this. This is literally running on every path besides our static assets. Now, the difference between the new version or the core 2.0 version of Clerk with the previous versions is that by default, this is not going to protect any of the routes. So everything is now public. If you need to protect any route, you need to tell this middleware to protect it, which we're going to see in next steps. But for now, we have Clerk. Now what we need to do is to also wrap our entire app with this Clerk provider. So let's just copy this part of the code and go back inside of our layout. And here, let me just import some of these Clerk components. We're not going to use this signed in here. We're going to add them inside of our header shortly. So let's wrap the entire HTML with this Clerk provider. And now you have access to user sessions inside of your app. Okay, so that's really what we need to do. You can just continue to the Next.js guide, where it is going to walk you through creating a custom sign in and sign up page. So before we do that, let me actually also update our header component to show some sign in buttons. So inside of here, maybe right after this theme toggle, I'm going to say if I'm signed in, and this is a control component from Clerk that allows you to conditionally render components depending on whether or not the user is signed in. So if I'm signed in, I want to show a user button. Again, this is another component from Clerk that shows an avatar of the user and a way for them to manage their account and sign out. And if I am not signed in, or if I'm signed out, I want to show a sign in button. So again, sign in button. Now this by default renders a button, but I want to render a ShadCN button just to keep my app consistent. So I'm going to just pass in my own button to this. So now let's go back to our app and refresh if we are running. We are not. Let's rerun the dev server. And if I go back to the home page and refresh, we should be able to see our sign in button inside of our home page or in the header. One more time. Okay, there we have it. So the sign in button is there. Now it's green because the primary color or the theme that I have chosen from ShadCN is green. So just to show you this, if you go to ShadCN and you go to the theme section, you can customize your theme to be really anything. Let's say I want to pick this violet color now. I can just select that and change the style and the border radius and whatnot, and then copy the code. This is basically going to give you the CSS variables that's used inside ShadCN component to apply the theme. So inside of your global CSS, you have this base layer. You can just entirely replace this with what you have copied, which is going to just change the CSS variables. And now if I go back to my component, to my application, you can see now it turned into that color. So let's leave it at that. I don't want to sign in yet, but if you remember, we want to sync Clerk data using webhook to our own backend. But before I do that, let's just create our custom sign in and sign up page, because right now, if I click the sign in, it still shows the sign in component from Clerk, so no problem. But this is a hosted sign in component or sign in page. If you want to have your own custom pages, you can. And that's what we're going to do next. So inside of this piece of the documentation that we clicked on after we create a new project, it actually goes and shows you how to create your sign in and sign up pages with Clerk. So really all you need to do is to create these catch-all, optional catch-all sign in and sign up routes, and export this sign up and sign in component that comes from Clerk. So let me just go in here, and I'm going to do something very similar here, and I'm going to show you what I'm doing. So inside of the app, let's just bring this in, sign in, and then sign up. Okay, so inside of the sign in page, I have this optional catch-all route. Inside of it, I'm just exporting this signing component from the Clerk Next package and wrapping it inside of my own containers, and something very similar inside of the sign up one. Now, once you do this, there's one more piece that you need to do, and that is we're going to get to this public route, but we need to bring in some environment variables, namely these two. This is going to tell Clerk that we are using custom sign in and sign up pages. I apologize if this was too small. So next public sign in URL is /sign in. So we are telling Clerk that we have custom sign in pages living at this path and the sign up. So you need to copy this. I'm going to bring them into my environment variables. So let's set them here. And I'm going to set them inside of my env and then come back. For consistency, let's just also wrap them in quotation. You don't need to wrap them in quotations. I just have like it like so. So let's just close this off. That global CSS. Okay, so now I have this sign in and sign up page. Before we actually talk about how you would go about telling Clerk what parts to protect inside of your app or what parts not to, we can go to our app now. I want to show you something now that we have this custom sign in and sign up pages. Our terminal is running. So if I now go to the sign in page, instead of directing me to that hosted version of my sign up page or sign in page, I'm now rendering my own custom sign in page, which shows my header and it's inside of my own site. It's literally rendering the same sign in component and sign up component, but inside of my own application. But we're not going to sign in yet. Let's also add a public protection or how to define routes. So when you want to define a route to be protected inside of your application, what you can do is say let's create a constant here, is protected. And then you're going to use the create, what is it called? Just bear with me for a second. Create route matcher. So create route matcher. And then to this, you can pass in some routes for this to work. So I can pass in an array of routes. Let's say I want to protect my profile page. Okay. So I create this. And inside of my middleware, now I can pass in a callback. This is going to receive the auth, that's a context, and then a request object, which is an instance of our next request. So from next server, then I'm going to have a function here. So I'm saying if, let's say, request.url, well, you just need to pass in the request, really. And then you can call the auth function like so. And then you can call the protect on it like so. Okay, so let me explain what we're doing. Now, if you remember, I mentioned that the new version of the middleware does not protect any of the routes. It runs on the routes, so you have access to Clerk and the session if there is any session, but it's not protected by default. If you need to protect a page, let's say like our profile page, you will create this function is protected using this create route matcher, and you can pass in any route that you want. And this is going to return a function. You pass the request object to this function when a request comes in to see whether or not this request is actually for that path. And if it is, well, you can do two things. One is manually create a redirect URL and then use the next middleware to redirect them to that specific URL. Or alternatively, you can use this auth object here. It gives you a protect function on it, which is going to automatically protect this page in that it is going to redirect the user to sign in if they're not authenticated. And if they are authenticated, it's just going to allow them to visit the page. So this automatically takes care of what we need to take care of. And if we are not inside of a protected page, we're going to return next response.next. So let's save this. Now, if you look at this piece of documentation here, it kind of taken the sign in and sign up page out of, or mark them as public and say, so everything else other than these two routes are going to be protected. So that's another way of doing it. So it's saying, is it a public route? Meaning that it's not signing or it is sign in and sign up page, because these needs to be public. If they are not inside of these two pages, we'll then protect. This is the similar way of how Clerk middleware was used to work before in the past, or one of the differences between the new version and the previous version is that the previous version would protect all of the routes by default. You had to opt it out if you wanted to make any route public, whereas the new one just leaves everything public and you can just tell it which path to protect. Now, if you want to have the same behavior as you had in the previous version, this is what you can do. You just basically remove these two or make these two public and everything else is now protected. Okay. So we're done with this part as well. So we have set up our authentication, we run the middleware, and we've added this profile as a protected path. Now in the next step, I want to sync my data with my database. So before I go ahead and sign in with an account, I want to sync that data with my own database. And we're going to use Clerk webhooks for this. So if you search the documentation for syncing Clerk data to your application, it is going to walk you through, first of all, setting up ngrok, because for Clerk to be able to send you a webhook, you cannot just be running on your local development. You have to use a tool like ngrok, which is going to point your local dev to a public URL with a tunnel so that Clerk can send the webhook to that public URL, which is then directed to your local dev area so that you can test webhooks in local development. If you haven't worked with ngrok, it's easy to set up. You can just go on ngrok.com and set up for an account. It's easy for Mac Windows, and then it is going to give you a random public URL every time you run this, point it to a local port, or you can also create a custom domain, so you're using the same domain every time that you're using ngrok. So that's the first thing we need. The second thing is to create an endpoint or a webhook inside of our Clerk dashboard. We're going to walk through this together. Then we're going to bring in a secret key from our webhook down into our local development area or in production to make sure that the webhook is actually coming from Clerk and not a third party. And then we're going to make sure that the webhook route or the API route is actually a public route, because Clerk needs to be able to call that, so we cannot protect that behind authentication. Now, by default, it is going to be a public route, so nothing to worry about here. But if you have protected all of your routes, just make sure that leave that public API route outside so Clerk can actually call it. Now they're using Swix to send this webhooks. It's going to automatically retry the failed webhooks and also confirms the signature on your end with the secret that we set from Clerk to make sure that the webhook is actually coming from Clerk. And then we're going to create an endpoint inside of our application to actually receive this webhook. So let's just start from top. I already have ngrok. If you don't, you can go ahead and install it. Let's go to Clerk dashboard. And now we can go to the configure page. Here is where you can configure your app and different social logins and connections that you want for your application. We're going to come down to a section which is called webhooks, and then we're going to create a new endpoint. Now, the ngrok that I am running, it's going to be running on, let me show you actually how we're going to run it, and then you're going to see it for yourself. So this is my local dev running, and then I'm going to create a new terminal. Okay, so here I would go ngrok http -- domain. This is how you would pass a custom domain, ngrok.app, and then port is going to be 3000. This is where our NextJs app is running. So we're going to open that. And now this HTTP or public URL is pointing into our local dev. This would enable us to allow our Clerk really to send a webhook to our application. So let's go back to our Clerk dashboard. And here we're going to pass in this URL. And then after that, we're going to go API and then webhooks /Clerk. So we're going to create this endpoint inside of our application, and we're basically telling Clerk anytime that the changes that we want happened, just send a post request or a webhook to this endpoint. We're going to process it on our own end. So that's our endpoint. And from the events, let's select all user related events. As you saw, there are different events that you can ask Clerk to send you a webhook. I'm going to select the user specific ones and then create. Now, from here, when you actually created your endpoint, which we're going to do together, you can test. You can also see some logs and attempts of this webhooks being sent and the different activities that you have here. But one thing that's important to protect your endpoint against other people to be able to send requests to your endpoint is this using this signing secret. So you're going to have to copy this signing secret into your local environment variable, and we're going to read this through our endpoint and then verify that the signature matches to make sure that it's coming from Clerk before processing the webhook. So I'm going to set this and be back. So again, as a reference, I added this webhook secret environment variable to .env.example. So you have a record of what you need to set over here. Now, we need to go inside of our app and actually create this endpoint. So I'm going to create a new folder called API. Inside of it, we're going to have another folder called webhooks. This is if you have different webhooks, and we're going to create one for Clerk. And then inside of it, I'm going to create a route.ts, which is going to create a route handler that is going to process any incoming request to that endpoint, similar to API endpoint in the previous versions of NextJs. So I've copied some code here, and let me explain to you what we're doing from a high level. Now let's, for now, comment out this part that belongs to Qstash or our Upstash workflow that we're going to do later on. So let me just also comment this part out for now. For now, all we need to do is to create a user inside of our own database to sync our data with Clerk. And anytime a new user is created using our Clerk management or application. So Clerk is using Swix under the hood. Let me just install this one as well. Let's go back to our development server, stop this, pm add Swix. This is to send, this is to send webhooks and also to verify the signature. So let's restart the dev server and let me explain to you what we're doing here from a high level. Now this part of this is coming from the documentation. So don't worry if it is a bit overwhelming. So first thing, we are reading the webhook secret that we just set from our dashboard to our local environment variables. Now using Swix, we're going to get the headers and the payloads off of our request and actually go ahead and verify to see if it contains the signature matching our secret, meaning that this is coming from our own Clerk account and not somebody else trying to hit this endpoint. And once we verify that this is valid, then we're going to get the event type out of our payload. Now we are limiting or narrowing down based on the event type. So user created, user updated, you can have for one user deleted. And as you saw, there are different events that Clerk can send you. So if you have selected other events, you can narrow them down here. Now for user created, I'm getting the user information such as first name, last name, email, and image out. And then using those, I'm just going to call the create user function we created in the beginning and pass this user data to create a new user inside of our own database. Once I do that, I revalidate my application and then I'm done with this. At the end, I'm sending a status 200 response, so Clerk knows that this webhook was processed successfully. At any point during this, if I'm encountering any error, I'm returning a response with a status of 400. So anytime you return a response with an error code status, webhook Clerk is going to then understand that this webhook encountered an error and is going to retry it using Swix. So you need to pass in a 200 response if it is successful. So with this, now we can go ahead and sign into our application, which is going to create a user account in Clerk. Clerk then is going to send a webhook to our own endpoint. We're going to process that and create an account inside of our own database. So let's test this out end to end. Here inside of my homepage, I'm going to click sign in. This is going to take us to our own sign-in page. If our local dev is still running, yes, it is running. So I'm going to continue with Google, select an account to log into my account, or create an account really at this part, because this is the first time that I'm creating an account. I'm allowing access to Clerk, and now I should be able to see a user button, meaning that I've already logged in. I can manage my account and I can log out. If I go to my Clerk dashboard and go to users, I should be able to see this newly created user. But more importantly, if I go to my Prisma Studio and go to my user dashboard or refresh this, I now see a user record also created with the email name. So now my database is synced with Clerk, meaning that I also have my users and any information really that Clerk has. I brought in very minimal information such as email, first name, last name, image URL, and a Clerk user ID, which connects this account to that foreign key or to the record that we have inside of our Clerk. Okay, now we have our user, but we have to still create an onboarding flow so that this user can go and select the company that they work for, because now inside of our application, this user doesn't belong to any company. So let's go to Clerk documentation, and if you search for onboarding, there is this guide inside of the doc that walks you through adding a custom onboarding to your authentication flow. And from a high level, what we're going to do, we're going to use 3 pieces of information or 3 pieces of different logic here to do this custom onboarding. And these 3 things are the session tokens, the public metadata for user, and the middleware. So what we're going to do is that we're going to store a specific property on the public metadata of a user object. Now, public metadata is a way that you can extend the user object in Clerk. So let's show that for a second. So let's go to metadata, user metadata. There are 3 different ways that you can extend the user object in Clerk or add metadata to your user object. The private metadata, public, and unsafe. The private one is only readable and accessible or writable from the server. Public is read and write from the server, but only read from the client API. And the unsafe is read and write from server and front-end API, hence the name unsafe. Now, depending on the type of data that you want to add to your user object, you can select which one is more suitable for your need. We're going to use the public metadata. So that's the first piece of the puzzle. We're going to add an onboarding completed true and false Boolean property to our public metadata so we can check and see, has the user completed the onboarding flow inside of our middleware? And if they haven't, we're going to redirect them back to the onboarding page, show them a form, allow them to select the company they work for. Once they select that, we're going to use a server action to update the Clerk data and also our database to say, hey, this user now belongs to a company. And we mark that public metadata field that we created, let's say onboarding completed. You can name it whatever you want. That just allows us to keep track of the user or check whether or not the user has completed. We're going to set that to true. So next time they're going to visit our application, we know inside of our middleware that they have already completed the onboarding flow, and then we pass them or send them wherever they decide they intended to go. Now, the session token piece is just allowing us to read this public metadata inside of our session JWT token. Now, this is an easier way if you wanted to reach the session or read the claims data inside of your JSON web tokens on the server. You can just add this public metadata to the session tokens, and this piece of the documentation is going to guide you through doing that. We're going to do this together so you can learn how to do this. Now, the first thing we want to do is to add custom claims to your session token. So the way you do this is by going to your Clerk dashboard. You can go to configure, and there's this session management section. You can select the session, and there's this option to customize session token. Okay, now I want to customize the JWT JSON web token to also contain a metadata field, and now this needs to point into user.public metadata, so you can just Click on the options that you have on the right hand side that auto populates this. Now this piece of information or user public metadata is going to be a part of your session claims that you can easily check in your backend. So we need to save this. So that's that first piece. Now, once you do this, if you're using TypeScript like I do, you would want to create a custom JSON Web Token Session Claims interface so that you get autocomplete. So all you need to do is to create a types folder inside of your application. Let me just show you how you would go about doing that. So you would create this types folder like so. Inside of it, there is a globals.d.ts. Inside of it, I'm creating a global interface with the metadata. And the field that we're going to add to every user is onboarding complete. This is a Boolean field. It's optional and it's false by default. And if they completed the onboarding flow, we're going to set this to true. So next time we're not going to redirect them to the onboarding page. So that's the first step. The second step is configure your middleware to actually read the session data. So let me just copy the code for the middleware and I'm going to explain what we're doing. So let's go to our middleware and let me replace the content of my middleware with this. So I still have the profile page. I created another function to check whether or not the user is trying to access the onboarding. And what we're doing here, we're using the auth function out of this context that we get. We can get the user ID and the session claims from the auth. So if the user is authenticated, we're going to have a user ID and we're going to have the session claims. Again, this is your JSON Web Token and all the information that comes by default in Clerk, but we've also extended that template to also include the user metadata. And down here by this if conditionals, I'm just checking to see if the user is signed in, but they have not completed the onboarding flow. I'm going to redirect them to the onboarding flow or onboarding page. If they haven't completed the onboarding and they are on the onboarding page, I'm just going to leave them alone to continue the flow and complete their form. In all the other cases, for example, here if they're authenticated and if the onboarding is already completed and they are trying to access the onboarding path, I'm just going to redirect them to homepage. So once you complete the onboarding, I'm not going to allow you to come back to the onboarding again. Anytime you try to visit the onboarding and you have already completed the onboarding, I'm going to redirect to homepage. And the way that I'm checking to see if you are on the onboarding path or not is, again, using this create route matcher functions, passing the onboarding path. This is going to return a function to you. You can pass the request object that you get inside of your middleware to this function, which is basically returning a Boolean of telling you whether or not you're on that path. And this is what we already had before. So for every protected route, we're going to use the auth and the protect function to automatically protect that page. And for everything else, we're just going to return the next function. These are our public routes, for example, after the user has signed in or before they have signed in or they have completed the onboarding flow. So with this update, we're just going to redirect the user to the onboarding page now, which makes sense now to create the onboarding page. So let me just go ahead and create the onboarding page here. We're going to have a folder called onboarding. Nope, let's rename this. It's onboarding. And then let's put a page.tsx inside of this. If I can type page.tsx. Let me copy this code and explain what we're doing here. Okay, so we need to create this onboarding form. Just bear with me for a second and then we're going to explain everything at the end. So I'm going to create a component called onboarding-form.tsx. Okay. So let's see what we are doing over here inside of the page. So we created a new page called onboarding, and inside of our middleware, we're redirecting the users to this page. Now we're getting all the companies, and we're going to just render a form with a company selector, just allowing the user to select a company, which then triggers a server action to update our data. So let's go inside of this onboarding form. Now, let's see from a high level what's happening here inside of this onboarding form. We're using React for hook forms, auth and server actions to actually do this update. We need to create these actions, schemas, and bring in these libraries. But before I do that, let's just from a high level see what's happening here. So we are using the user or get the user from the use user function or hook from Clerk. We are getting the use form. This is React hook forms. If you're not comfortable with React hook forms and the integration with auth for verification, there's a video on the channel linked in the description. You can just look at that where I walk through details. But basically, we only have one field inside of our form, which is company slug. Now, the reason why we created company slug, let me just go back and make sure, and this is actually correctly defined here. Now, the way that I want to connect a user to a company is actually through company slug and not company ID. You can do it with company ID too, but the reason why I'm doing this is that on every user data, without me having to fetch this connection, I can have this company slug already. So I'm using company slug instead of company ID. It's the same thing, the same concept, but I just found it easier if I am connecting the user through company slug rather than company ID. So they're going to select the company slug that they belong to, and the way that I am allowing them to read and write this company slug, because I don't have an input field down here, it's a selector that you're going to see in a second. So I apologize if it is confusing at this point. We're rendering a card and a company selector here. So let's add this company selector. Which is going to show a drop down of all the companies and a way for the user to just select the corresponding company. So company selector .tsx. So this company selector is just going to render a combo box from ShatCN. So if you go to ShatCN to understand how this is working inside of the components, there's this combo box, which is a combination between a popover and a command. So popover is what pops over and gives you this drop down, and then the combo box is allowing you to actually type in and select something. So we want to render something similar to this, where the user can just search for their company and then use a checkbox to select it. And the way that we are doing it here with the check icon and this company item and what they're selecting, I need a way to communicate this to our React hook form, and I'm doing that through these functions that I created here. So I created this selected company, calling this get values that I get out of the use form to read the value, and then I'm exposing a function called set selected company that calls a set value from use form to set the company slug to whatever that was passed in from that selector children. Now, typically when you're using React hook forms, you're going to use this register function and spread them over, let's say, an input field. So when you have an input field, this is automatically going to get this getter and setter functions on that input and update the state. But because I'm using this custom combo box component, I can't just register or spread out whatever comes out of that register function on my input field. Instead, I'm creating these functions manually to then pass down to this company selector that we created together. So I have the list of the companies, the selected company, that's our value really, and then the set selected company is the state updater function that this allows us to communicate whatever the user is selecting back to our React hook form. Now, once our React hook form actually verifies the company slug, based on this onboarding schema we're going to create together, which is an object with only one field of company slug. Then it's going to create or call this process form. We are passing this process form to the handle submit we got back from the use form, pass it to the on submit form event handler. Now, again, this might seem a bit confusing if you haven't worked with React Hook forms before. Definitely watch the video linked in the description where we walk through different aspects of this, starting from simple React Hook forms, then adding auth validation, then adding server actions step by step. So that can help you get up to speed if this is a bit overwhelming now. Now, assuming that you already know this, I'm just going a bit faster here to be able to get to the main point, which is actually finishing and updating the user once this form is submitted. Before we jump into the process form, let's just create the stuff that we need for this. So we need to install Zod and React Hook forms. So let's go here and let's pm add Zod. Let's pm add React Hook form and also the hook form dash resolvers. Okay, we need to create an action. So this is what we need here. Let's go to company selector and see if you're missing anything here. We need the command component from ShadCN UI. So pm dlx ShadCN add latest add command. Okay, let's pm dev again. Should be good now. Okay, so let's go back to our form. Now we need to create an onboarding action. This is a server action and a schema. Let's just start from schemas. So inside of my lib, I'm going to create a new module called schemas.ts. And I'm just going to create a simple Zod schema for our onboarding form. So we get the Zod out of Zod. And then our onboarding schema, which is our form really. The shape of our form only needs a company slug as a string, and it's required, so minimum of 1 character. Okay, so now we can have this imported here. Let's just re-import it. Sometimes it doesn't take effect. Maybe we can just reload, which is going to reload our VS Code. Sometimes reloading the TS server would help with this. Now for actions, this is where we're actually going to update our user. So as I mentioned, when the form validation goes through and the user actually selected a company, we will call this process form. Now inside of this process form, we're going to pass the data of our form to this complete onboarding server action, which is going to update our user in the database and also in Clerk, and then show an error message if something goes wrong. And if everything goes well, we're going to return the slug, which is the company slug that the user selected, back to the front end. We're going to reload the user object. This is the user object from Clerk. So we have updated them in the back end. We want to also reflect those updates in the front end. So we refresh the user object, and then we're going to redirect them to that company slug page or the company that they work for, show them a toast success message. Okay, so that's what we are really doing. Now, in terms of the actions, let's actually go ahead and create this. I usually do this inside of my lib. I create actions. If you have so many actions, you can maybe create multiple actions modules, but for now, I just have one. So I'm going to create this. Now I'm going to copy my action over here. Now, the convention here is to use server directive up top. Anytime that you are defining all of your server actions in one file, this is the convention you can take. Now, this instructs NextJs to treat all of the functions you export from this file as a server action. Now, if you're not comfortable with server actions, or for even most of the topics that we talk about in this video, there is going to be individual videos on my channel. So definitely search on my channel for any topic that I talk, even if I don't mention that there's a video about it. There's almost a video about every single topic on Next.js. So server actions is nothing different. There is videos on the channel about server actions, what they are and how to use them. But basically from a high level, they're just functions you define on the server. You can pass them and call them from the client, just as what we are doing here in response to our form submission to then update something inside of our server. So let's see what we're doing here. Well, first, we're checking to see if we have an authenticated user. If we don't, we're going to return an error. Once we parse the schema and make sure that the data is coming to our server action is actually what we're expecting, which is an object with a company slug, we're going to use Clerk client, which is a wrapper around Clerk that talks to Clerk API to then update. So we access the users and update user with this user ID, that's the logged in user, and we add this public metadata. So we say onboarding complete sets to true, and I'm also saving the company slug as well inside of my public metadata or the user object. So therefore, anytime that I'm accessing the user object using Clerk on the front end, I can just get the company slug if I needed to redirect them there or know what company they work for. That's a way to know what company they work for inside of my user object in Clerk. Now, after doing that, we're going to also update our user inside of our database. So the update user is a function we created in the beginning of this video, where we are using the Prisma client and updating a specific user data. So we are not only updating user in Clerk, but we are updating it inside of our database as well. Now I'm going to get rid of this error in a second because we have updated our schema without running the Prisma generate, and that's why we're getting this as squiggly lines. But I want to mention something here. Now you have two options for updating the user inside your database here. The option number one is what I did here. So you're just directly after you're updating Clerk or your user inside Clerk, you are just running whatever logic that needs to update the user in your database here. The other option is that listening to our webhook that comes from Clerk. Because if you remember inside of our webhook, when we were setting it up in Clerk, we actually said send all user related data or changes to us. One of those triggers is user updated. So inside of here, I'm not extracting the public metadata, but you can get the metadata here and update user just using that same function, but inside of your webhook this time to keep your data in your database in sync with Clerk. Now, the benefit of doing it inside the webhook is that if anything goes wrong during this update, you can return a 400 response, which in turn is going to tell Clerk to resend that webhook. You have to implement some sort of reliability here inside of your server action too, to make sure if this piece of your code didn't go through, you're just retrying this. So maybe it's better to just do it in webhook so that you keep this central. That's the point in your application where you sync data between Clerk and your database, do everything there. If a user is created, updated, or deleted. But I just wanted to mention that there's two ways to do this. So let's just run this Prisma generate so we can get rid of this error. So pm dlx Prisma generate. And let's also go pm dlx Prisma db push. And let's restart the dev server. Let's go to this Prisma Studio. pm dlx Prisma Studio. So we update this studio as well. Okay. So let's close this off. And okay, so let's review what has happened from a high level one more time. So we created this new onboarding page. And we are redirecting our users who have not completed the onboarding process to this page. In here, we had this onboarding form where we are showing the user a selection of all the companies so that they can select what company they work for through this React hook forms and the company selector that we created here, custom components, just accomplishing what I explained. Once they select, they're going to invoke this server action. The server action, in case, is going to run in the backend on the server. It's going to update the user data in Clerk and also update the user inside of our own database. Okay, so let's see this end to end. Now, if you look at the right-hand side, and if you noticed, let me just make this a bit bigger, I am automatically redirected to the onboarding. This is because the Clerk middleware ran once I updated the application and rerun the dev server. It realized there is a signed in user, but the user doesn't have or hasn't completed the onboarding flow. So it's redirecting me to the onboarding, where it is showing this little React hook form, or the form we created really using React hook form, and the company selector, which is just this drop-down menu. Now we only have one company here. It's a Studio Edge. But if there was more, they would have shown up here, and we could have just searched for that specific company. Once the users select this and submit this form, this is going to invoke our server action. It's going to update the user, and hopefully it's going to redirect us back to our company slug page, which didn't quite happen. Okay, so let's see what went wrong here. Let's just close this terminal off. And I think I know what's going wrong here. So I updated this company slug to be the relationship field between a user and the company, but I forgot to change this reference. So for your relations in Prisma, I'm saying this user is connected to a company, and the relationship field is this company slug that I have here, which is referencing not the ID, but the slug inside the company model. So because it couldn't find any company with that slug, which is literally the ID, it did not work. So let's just stop the dev server. pm dlx prisma generate. If I can type pm dlx prisma db push. pm dev. Just for good measures, let's stop this studio as well. pm dlx prisma studio to just read the new schema. Let's close this, go back. And if I refresh, you see this user hasn't been updated correctly, but I'm expecting this to go back to our homepage now. And the reason why is now the user has this public metadata. Now to check, let me show you. Inside the user object, if you go here, you can actually see their public metadata. So you can see here, we have updated Clerk correctly. We have added this public metadata. The company slug is Studio Edge, and the onboarding is completed. So inside of our application, the user is just back to the homepage, and they cannot go to the onboarding again because now they have completed the onboarding. So that's the part that I was talking about. So inside of our server action, if you pay attention to how our server action was running, this part of the code, which updates the user inside of Clerk, ran correctly, updated the public metadata, and we can see it here on the right hand side. We have the public metadata set, and I might be in the way there, but you get the idea. But this piece of code, which is going to update the user inside of our database, didn't go through. And we had no way to retry this, or we didn't have that logic. And that's one of the reasons why you would want to do this in a single point of truth inside of your webhook. So anything goes wrong, you can just retry. I'm not sure if this would have gone wrong or send out any errors, because we did not return any errors. In case of an error, we would have shown an error and say something went wrong. But this didn't even error out. It just couldn't find the company with that slug because we mismatched the reference to reference the ID instead of the slug, or we should have corrected that, and it couldn't find that company to connect the two tables or records together. Nonetheless, if I now go back, so let's go delete this user inside of our Clerk account and go to our database and users, and let's just delete this user from here as well to just see this end to end one more time inside of our app. If I refresh now, I don't have any logged in user, so I'm going to go ahead and sign in using Google, selecting my account, continuing to our homepage. I'm now signed in. The webhook comes in, the middleware runs. I haven't completed the onboarding, so I'm redirected to the onboarding page. I select the company that I belong to. I hit submit, and this is going to redirect me back to this company page. And now I'm shown as a team member of this company. Okay, so it works end to end. Now, we don't want to stop here. We want to add more to it. First of all, the form that we added for our onboarding was a simple form. Just select the company. You can make that as complex as your application requires, multi-step forms or different flows that they have to complete. Now, one thing that I want to do, or a tool that I want to introduce here that makes this process of scheduling tasks and running works and jobs in the background easy, is Qstash, which is a service from Upstash. Now, you might be familiar with Upstash through their Redis platform. This is a database, or a key value pair database. We have talked about Upstash on the channel, about rate limiting your API endpoints using one of the packages created by creators of Upstash. They have a vector database, but they also have this Qstash, which is a messaging and scheduling task for serverless. So let me just go back and actually go to the docs before logging into the platform. So here under the Qstash, you can read more about what Qstash is, but from a high level, it acts as a middleman between you and the API. So instead of you calling the API directly, you call it through Qstash. Now, this allows you to, first of all, automatically retry. So it guarantees delivery and retries on failure and gives you some more features, some more observabilities into what's happening in these API calls. Now, workflow is something that is built on top of Qstash. So the way that workflows work is it's literally using Qstash behind the scene, but it allows you to break down the logic that you want to run into multiple steps. So let's say inside of the webhook we receive from Clerk, when we are creating a user account, we actually want to do more. We want to create an account. We want to send them a welcome email. Maybe we want to wait 3 days and see if they have completed the onboarding or not. We can send them a link to complete the onboarding. Once they completed the onboarding, we want to send them a follow-up email. So there is a series or steps of tasks that we want to do. We can design that inside of a workflow that runs on top of Qstash. And it is in a flowchart like this, where you would call the workflow API that you create using the SDK. You would define different steps to it. Now, the benefit is that, first of all, each one of these steps can expand to your maximum time duration or execution time for your serverless functions, because any of these API endpoints that you're deploying to a platform like Vercel, as I mentioned, are going to be deployed as a serverless function. And serverless functions have an execution time limit. I think it's 10 seconds on the free account, and you can bump it up to 100 seconds on paid accounts or on pro accounts. Now, when you have a workflow running that's longer running, by using the workflow API, now instead of the whole complex logic needing to finish in 10 seconds, imagine you're running some LLMs or text generations, image generations, or you want to send the user a custom message, and this is going to be long running. So instead of running the whole logic in one step, you could just divide it into multiple steps, and each one of those steps now is a dedicated HTTP call, which can expand to the maximum execution time. So you get more time without having to run to timeouts on execution time on serverless functions. But you get also automatic retry. So if any of these steps fail, instead of having to run this whole logic again, you can just run that step that failed until it succeeds. Now, this diagram shows that these steps are then called or passed into QStash. Once they are successful, it's going to invoke the next step that you've defined in your workflow. We're going to walk through that in a second until this whole thing is done. Now, to create a workflow, there's the getting started where it talks about how it works and a possible or potential use cases here. So for example, you can have an image processing workflow where the user uploads an image. You then queue that to be processed. So maybe you wanted to make the image, process the image and make it more performant. You would do that in a background job inside your workflow. And this allows you to immediately return to your user and say, okay, the image is queued for processing. Instead of letting them hang until the processing is done, you can just immediately return to your user, which is a better user experience, and then take care of that task behind the scene to process the image. Another use case which we're going to do is customer onboarding. So user creates an account. Maybe if you're using or having a multi-tenant application, you can create or provision storage and compute for that user, send them a welcome email, wait 3 days, do this and do that. So it's workflow and whatever really you can imagine, you can just set up in different steps and use the Upstash workflow, which is an amazing tool to fulfill that steps or workflow. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start with the quick start guide that they have here for Next.js. So this allows you to actually create a workflow in Next.js. Now, what you need to do is to create an Upstash account, and you need to get your QStash key or token to be able to talk to QStash, because at the end of the day, the workflow is sitting on top of QStash, and you need to install that. So the first step is to create an account. I've already created an account, so let's just open it up here. Let's log in. Okay, so under the QStash, there are different tabs up there. Under the QStash is where you can get your QStash token. We have to bring this into our local dev. So let me just copy this into my local dev and I'll come back. Okay, so I have copied my QStash token, and as a reference again, I've included this in our local.env.example. If you click on this little copy icon, it copies the actual token, which you can bring it to your local dev. So that's our dashboard. You can see the previously running workflows. For example, I've tested this out. You can see each workflow running. We're going to define this workflow in a second. I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but this dashboard just gives you some more observability onto different steps that has run and what has happened in each one of these steps. And you can retry them if they failed right here from the dashboard. You can have your events. This is your QStash events and whatnot. The schedules that you can run schedules, background jobs. You can queue tasks together. So it's pretty extensive. The workflow is just a simplified version of the QStash, allowing you to define these workflow steps. But the QStash actually is beyond workflow. They have background jobs, queues, and more that you can read through the documentation. So let's go back to the docs and install Upstash QStash. So let's go here, open up our terminal, stop the dev server, pm add Upstash QStash. So that's the first step. The second step is passing our environment variable. I've already done this, so I've brought in the QStash token from my dashboard to my local environment variable. Now we can create a workflow endpoint. So a workflow is literally an API endpoint that you're going to create using this serve function from QStash and then defining different steps. So let me actually bring in a workflow that I have created, which is a simple version of or a similar thing to what we have over here. So we're going to go inside of our app, go inside the API. We're going to create a new folder. Let's call this workflow. Inside of the workflow, I'm going to have a route webhook.ts. Again, this is a regular route handler inside of your Next.js app. Close this and the terminal. So let's see, what are we doing here? So we're using this serve function from the package we just installed. This is going to allow you to create a workflow endpoint. Now this receives a context. On this context, you can run different steps. You can make HTTP calls. You can let it sleep or create delays. Again, reference the docs for what you can run on this context. But this is how you would create different steps inside of your workflow. For example, in first step, I am running a step called send welcome email. This gives you a callback in which you can just include the logic to send an email. Let's say you are using resend to send an email. There's a video on the channel where I walk through sending an email using resend. Here you can use the same logic, so watch that video. But I'm literally just console logging as if I'm sending an email. I'm not here, but you can just replace this logic with whatever that needs to happen in this first step. As a second step, I wait until 3 days. So we can change that to 3 days. This is in seconds, so you can pass in number of seconds. So it sleeps for 3 days, then sends a follow-up email. Now you can do really whatever you want here. You can just fetch the user from the database and see if they have completed the onboarding flow. If not, then send them a link or follow up with some instructions or what they can do on the community platform, send another email, hook to other services, sync to other services. So you can do really whatever that requires for your app. But as an example, I'm just console logging here. So let's turn this back to 10 and let's watch this workflow running in action. Now, something that we're going to do on top of what we have here is that in the request that we send to this workflow API to trigger our workflow, we can pass in data. For example, I can pass in the user data to then use that for the email that I'm sending. But let's say we are not doing that for now, just so I show you how you would go about triggering this workflow API. Let's just add more console logs that don't have any variables in them. So let's say console log welcome email sent and console log follow-up email sent. Now going back to the documentation, if you want to run the workflow endpoint, because Qstash needs to call this API endpoint on your behalf to go step by step, you need to actually tell Qstash where this local URL or where your code or this API endpoint actually lives. So we're going to do that through this Upstash workflow URL. So we're going to set this to our public ngrok domain. So let's go to our .env.example and close this off. And here I'm going to create this and say, well, my application lives at hamed.ngrok.app. Yours might be a random URL and it's okay. But you have to point this here for ngrok to be able, for Qstash to be able to call this workflow API. Now, just to explain this or just to be more clear, what happens is each one of these steps now become a call. If you remember the image that I showed in the beginning of the workflow, anytime you're defining a workflow and these steps, these are run by Qstash. So Qstash is going to call this API endpoint, run the task, then get the message or the result and invoke the next step, which is another call to your endpoint. So Qstash it needs to be able to call this API endpoint, and that's why we need to tell it where it actually lives. So let me update my env variable and then I'll be back. Okay, so I have updated my environment variable, and now that we have set this Upstash workflow URL, there is another way to also tell Qstash where our application is living, and that's through the base URL option that you can pass into this serve function. So this serve function that we are creating, you can also pass an options object to it and set a base URL and define that there. But what I like about this way of doing it is that we would set this in local development, but in production, we can just forget this part of it because QStash is going to automatically read the URL from the request object. It's only for local development that we need this. So then I just using the environment variable, I don't need to update the code. I can just use that and don't include that in production, and I should be good to go. Now, how do we trigger the workflow? Well, the workflow is literally an API endpoint that's running in your application. So if we run our application, so if we go pm dev, okay, so let's create a new terminal. I'm going to use git bash that allows me to actually send a curl command. So -x, a post request, and the endpoint is going to be https hamid.ngrok.app, and then it lives at API/workflow. So I'm sending a post request to that endpoint, which is going to invoke that endpoint. It's going to give me a workflow run ID back. But if I go to my main terminal where I'm running my dev server, you can see here, I got the welcome email sent. That's the first step. It waited for 10 seconds because that's what we created here. So it waits for 10 seconds and then sends the follow-up email. So this is how we are running this workflow. But where do we want to invoke this workflow? We don't want to have to send a request to this API endpoint anytime that we want this to run. Now, one place to run this is inside of our webhook. So inside of API webhooks and Clerk, where a new user is created, what we can do here is also trigger a request to that API endpoint using the QStash client. Now, before I get to the QStash client, one way to invoke this API endpoint is to just send a fetch request, right? So you can just send a fetch request to Upstash workflow API and then have a method post and send whatever user ID. Now, in this instance, what I want to do from this endpoint is that I want to pass in the user data, just like how you were seeing it inside of our workflow. I was expecting to get some user data, so I can comment these back in. And let's also bring this back in. So I'm expecting to receive some payload in the body of this request that comes to this API endpoint. Now, one way to do this is to just send a fetch request to that endpoint. It triggers our workflow. I'm passing in the data that it needs. So therefore, it uses it to just follow through the steps and finish our workflow. But there's a problem here. This API endpoint we just created, this API endpoint, or what lives here, is now a public API endpoint. Just as how we secured our webhook endpoint with the secret we got out of Clerk to make sure that it matches the signature, making sure that the request is actually coming from Clerk, we want to do something similar here in the workflow too, whereas only QStash can call and trigger this workflow API and not anybody else. Even though this is a public route, we want to secure this so only QStash can call this. Now, the way you can do this is by exporting two variables from your local environment variable. So if you go to the QStash dashboard, under this signing keys, there's two signing keys. One is current signing key and the other one is next signing key. So if you include these two inside of your environment variables, QStash is going to automatically read them and protect this API endpoint with this serve function. So only the matching requests that have this signature can pass through and trigger your workflow API. everything else, like the curl command that we just sent, won't work. So let's test this out. I'm going to include this inside of my environment variables first and then continue. So I've added the current signing key and the next signing key from my dashboard by clicking on these copy buttons and adding them to my local environment variable. And that's all you need to do for this to protect your API endpoint for Qstash to be triggering your workflow API. So let me just comment this back to not needing the user object. And I just want to show you what happens if I now trigger the same curl command that we had before. But this time, because we have the environment variables, this is not going to go through. And you can see here message failed to verify the workflow request coming from Qstash. So by just exporting those environment variables, this serve function inside of your workflow is going to automatically read the request headers, and it looks for the signature using the secret key that you have set up, and only allow Qstash to trigger this. Now going back to our webhook where we were syncing the data from Clerk to our database. So where we actually want to trigger this workflow. So one way, as I said, is to send a fetch request. So inside of our Clerk webhook, where a user signs in, they come in. The first thing that we did was to create a user in our database. Now, maybe at this point, we want to trigger a series of actions to be followed and queued to perform a welcome or onboarding flow. Now, one way is to send a fetch request, but this fetch request is going to fail because it does not come from Qstash and it does not have the required signatures to pass through to be able to trigger our workflow API. And that's why we are using this Qstash client, because it automatically, again, reads the environment variables and includes the necessary headers for your application to actually allow this. So let me bring Qstash. This is what we commented out in the beginning. So we are getting the client from Qstash. We are creating new Qstash client by passing in the token, setting it to our Qstash token that we copied in the beginning to be able to talk and use Qstash. Now using that Qstash client, what I can do is I can publish JSON. This is just basically sending a request to this API endpoint, which is my workflow URL. Right now is my local dev tunneled through my ngrok public URL and API workflow. This is where my workflow API endpoint lives. So I want to send a request, and in the body of that request, I want to pass in the user information. So I can read this user information here inside of my workflow API to send customized emails and messages to my users. Okay, so that's one place to trigger this workflow. Another logic may be that you're like, okay, I don't want to trigger this workflow when they create an account. I only want to maybe trigger this workflow once they have completed the onboarding. Where do we know that they have completed the onboarding? Well, inside of our server action, so inside our lib actions, when we call this onboarding action complete in response to the form submission, once they selected the company that they belong to, we invoke this server action to update the user. We updated the user data in Clerk and inside of our own database. An alternative place to trigger this workflow is here to say, okay, only once they have completed the onboarding, I want to send them extra information. I want to schedule a task and whatnot. Really doesn't matter where you do it, just depends on your application logic. So you can do it from both places. But from whatever place that you do, you need to use the Qstash client with the necessary signing keys set in your local environment variables to be able to pass the signature verification so that it can trigger actually the workflow API. Okay, so to test this end to end one more time, let's just go back and go here. Let's just stop this dev server so we can see this everything fresh. Now, what I want to do is go back to our Clerk. Let's refresh this. Let's delete our user from here. Let's go to our database, refresh, and actually also delete this user. So our application now doesn't have a user. Let's go to the next. Actually, you know what? Let's just go to this ngrok that's hopefully running. Okay, so let's open up our ngrok app. We don't have any user. We shouldn't have. We just deleted it. Let's wait for Clerk to load up. Okay, here we go. So we can go ahead and sign in and see everything in action. So I'm going to sign in with Google, select my account. This is going to create an account in Clerk, trigger the webhook, create the user account inside of our database, send the user to the onboarding flow where they can complete the onboarding flow, selecting and submitting. And now if you look at the console here, you can see welcome Hamid sending an email to my email. Now it has the user information because when I was triggering this workflow API, I also included the user information inside of my webhook. This triggered our workflow API, send the welcome email, waited 10 seconds, and send the follow-up email at the end. So this is end-to-end. You can see these tasks are queued one after the other. All after 10 seconds can be updated to the 3 days. But you get the idea. It doesn't have to be these steps. It can be any step or anything that you want. Again, reference the documentation for what you can do here in terms of the different functions you can run. So inside of this quick start, the basics, you can come to how to and read different things you can do. There's examples, REST APIs, and how it works. So you can dive a bit deeper into how this works, specifically the functions you have access on the context and what you can do. Context.run, context.sleep, context.sleep until. Call is just making an HTTP request. Really, you can call OpenAI to generate text images and whatnot. And the good thing is that it gives you guarantee of delivery, automatic replies, and also the extended execution time that you get out of your serverless functions. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We didn't create the events endpoint or the community post endpoint because the focus of this video was mainly creating a custom onboarding flow using the technologies that we mentioned from Clerk authentication and Upstash workflow, managing our data inside of our Neon database. But the logic is going to be the same. You can create an endpoint to show all of your events, a way for your users to create events and to create community posts. What I would use for the community posts, which is just like basically blog posts, is the same novel WYSIWYG editor that we had in a couple of videos back that allows you to use a Notion style editor to write a blog post and then publish that blog post. So it's easy. So we would leave that for you. You can access the source code in the link in the description. If you have any questions, like always, hit me up in the comments and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.